friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. Today we're going to be talking about all the books that I read in January. So it is now February, time to recap how January went. If you are new to my end of month wrap-ups, the way that I do these is I start by talking about all of my stats for the month, because I am a stats nerd. Then I talk about all the books that I read, starting with my DNFs, or books that I didn't finish, my lowest rated books, moving up to my highest rated books. Some of these books I did talk about in more detail in my mid-month wrap-up, so for those books I'm just going to be telling you what they are and telling you the star rating. If you want to hear more detailed thoughts on those books, you can check out my mid-month wrap-up, which is linked up above. With that said, let's go ahead and dive right in. First month of the year. Okay, so this was an interesting reading month. I was able to read quite a lot. It was a strong reading month in terms of the amount of things I was getting to. Ratings were a little bit more of a mixed bag. I had more low-rated books than I usually do, but I also had more new favorites than I usually do in a month. So it was a little polarized in an unusual way. In January, I read a total of 34 books, which is 11,338 pages. That number does include my audiobooks, and that is an average page count per day of 366, which is like pretty typical for me. This month, I DNF'd 3 books, which we will talk about, and 17 of the books that I read were either ARCs or books that were in some way sent to me for review. Is that number higher than what I want it to be? Yes, it is. I'm working on decreasing it, but probably you're going to see higher numbers this month and in February. And then in the following months, I'm hoping that the number of books for review is going to decrease and I'll be able to get 2 more books that are backlist titles on my TBR. In January, I read 1 indie published book. I did not have any rereads. I read 1 work of translated fiction, and I read 1 graphic novel. And as usual, I did read quite a lot of audiobooks. Almost half of my reading was audiobooks, which is pretty typical. It seems to usually be somewhere in the like 35 to 50% range of how much of it is audiobooks. In February, 16 of the books that I read were via audio, and 7 of those were what I term shelf, which means that I had a physical copy on my shelves and got it off my TBR through audio. In terms of where those audiobooks were coming from, the bulk of them were coming from my library. 8 of those audiobooks were from my library. Then I had 3 from Audible, 1 audio review copy from NetGalley, 1 audio review copy from the Penguin Random House Volumes app. This month I didn't listen to anything on Scribd, and I had 2 influencer review copies from Libra FM. If you aren't familiar with Libra FM, you can check them out down below. They're a really great audio service. I get a few titles every month that I can download for free in exchange for talking about them, and I think they're a really great service. So check them out down below if you're interested. In terms of age breakdown, this was also a very unusual month coming off of last year. I usually read predominantly adult titles and not much middle grade at all. This month was very unusual. 17 of the books that I read were targeted at an adult audience. 13 of the books that I read were targeted at a YA audience, and a whopping 4 books were targeted at a middle grade audience. I definitely anticipate reading more middle grade this year than I did last year, just because there are more middle grade series that I'm trying to read and things that I'm wanting to get to. But yeah, so it's a little bit different, but it's been fun. Next, let's look at the publication dates of the books that I read. In January, the earliest publication date of a book was 1974, and 12 of the books that I read were published prior to 2020. So we're calling those backlist titles. Then I read 6 2020 releases and 15 2021 releases. Again, this is because I am reading more books for review. I do want to see that drop a little bit as we go through the year, but it's fine. Then looking at my diversity stats, this is also not what I would like it to be, and again, I think it has to do with the books that I had for review. So this kind of skewed my stats, hoping to course correct moving into February. Still not terrible, but I'm generally aiming to have about 50% of my reading be by authors of color. This month, only 38% of my reading was by authors of color, but especially going into February with Black History Month, I would anticipate those numbers changing dramatically. And one thing that I do think is interesting is that typically my biggest percentage is Black authors, and it still is the biggest, but not by much. 18% of my reading was by Black authors, and 15% was by South Asian authors, so I thought that was kind of interesting. Then 27% of the books that I read were written by queer authors, members of the LGBTQIAP+ community, which is great. I'm aiming for about 25% of my reading, so that looks good. Okay, next let's look at genre. Again, this is different. I think almost every month in 2020, my highest read genre was romance. In January, it was not. My highest read genre was fantasy with a total of 13 books. Coming in after that is romance. I read 7 romance novels, and in terms of subgenres, 2 of those were contemporary romances, 2 of them were historical romances, and 3 of them were speculative romances. I also read 3 nonfiction titles, 2 contemporary fiction, 2 thrillers, 2 sci-fi, 2 mystery, 1 poetry, and 1 historical fiction. So yeah, kind of an interesting breakdown there. Next, let's look at my star ratings. You're gonna see kind of what I was saying. This is, again, a little unusual for me. This month I did not give out any 1 or 1.5 star ratings. Not surprising, I very rarely do give those out. I did, however, have 2 books that got 2 stars and 2 books that got 2.5 stars, which is more on the low end than I typically have. 4 books got 3 stars, 4 books got 3.5 stars, 10 books got 4 stars, and this was by far the most frequent rating that I gave this month. 5 books got 4.5 stars, only 3 books got 5 stars, and then 4 books got 6 stars. And on my personal rating scale, a 6-star read is a favorite of the year or a favorite of all time. So it's interesting to me that I had 4 books that were really, really amazing, and then a lot of books that either weren't great or were good but not amazing. It was an interesting reading month. And then last thing that we're gonna add is I wanna keep track of how I'm doing with the challenges that I set for myself at the beginning of the year. I have specific books in different categories that I wanna get to, and so I wanna kind of keep track of how many of those I've done. So first up, I had a challenge to read 8 classic books. Some of those are specific titles, some of them are more general. This month I read 1 of the 8, so I'm up to 1 out of 8 read. I also have 9 science fiction and fantasy titles that I want to read this year, and this month I read 1 of those, so 1 out of 9 has been completed for the year. And then finally, I have 14 books that I want to read in order to catch up on or complete series. I had a list of series that I wanted to catch up on this year, and this month I read 1 of those, so 1 out of the 14 has been completed. So I'll kind of update you as we go. All right, with that said, let's go ahead and dive into the books that I read. We will actually start with my DNFs. Those are the books that I did not finish, and this month there were 3 of them, which is a little more than usual. I will say one of them technically was February 1st, but it was on my January TBR, and it was so early on that I'm including it here. Just as an FYI. Okay, so one of the books that I DNF'd I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. That book is Love is a Revolution by Renee Watson. If you want to hear more details, check out my mid-month wrap-up. I also DNF'd City of the Uncommon Thief by Lynn Bertrand. This is a book that I had for review from NetGalley, and the writing was not working for me. I did not like it. I DNF'd it pretty quickly too, at about 10%. I tried to push myself that far before DNFing it, but I was like, no, I can't read this. It's a debut YA fantasy, but it's kind of a strange one. the writing is just so odd. It does not explain anything. It kind of dumps you in the middle of the story and doesn't give you any context for the world or what's happening or who the characters are or why you should care about any of them. And I really wasn't enjoying it. It also had a lot of references to things like Greek mythology thrown in, which I like Greek mythology, but the way that it was doing it without context, without explanation, felt kind of pedantic, and it was just kind of off-putting to me. So not a book for me. And when I checked reviews, I was certainly not the only one who felt this way, so I don't really feel bad about it. Some people are enjoying it, so if you can kind of get past that, maybe it would work better for you than me, but yeah, I DNF'd that one. And then the other one I DNF'd, I am really, really sad about because this was a highly anticipated book for me. I actually thought, I thought in my head that this was going to be one of my favorite books of the year, so that is unfortunate. This is A Dark and Hollow Star by Ashley Shuttleworth, and I will tell you, other people are really enjoying this book much more than I did, and I think the premise is fantastic, so that I had very high hopes for it. For me, it was the writing. I could not get into the writing, and like I think I would have just been like hate reading it if I was reading it, which is unfortunate because I think the ideas are interesting. It's being pitched as City of Bones meets The Cruel Prince. It's a YA fantasy, urban fantasy set in a underworld in Toronto with fae and a queer cast of characters, which sounds great. Like that sounds like all things I would enjoy. But yeah, I get a little bit more into detail about my issues with it in my Goodreads review. I do write reviews for all of my DNFs, even if I don't rate them. But yeah, I just couldn't do the writing, which is such a bummer. No one is more disappointed than me because I really wanted to love it. And there are reviews of people who enjoyed it much more than I did. So I think if you can get past the writing style, to me it felt very overwritten. The prose was kind of clunky. I didn't like the narrative choices it was making. I pushed myself to get to 5% and it was a struggle to get there. So yeah, I'm sorry. It was kind of a bummer. I had very high hopes for this one. But again, everybody has different taste when it comes to writing style. So if it doesn't bother you, if you like it, it might be great because some of the reviews seem to think that the story is good. So yeah, but bummer. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead and move on to the books that I did finish reading, beginning with my 2-star reads. Like I said earlier, there were 2 books that got a 2.5-star rating from me. One of them I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up, and that is a short story called The Princess Game by Soman Chainani. If you want to hear my thoughts on that, check out my mid-month wrap-up. I also, another sad one, there were a few I was really disappointed about this month, but I also gave 2 stars to First Comes Like by Alicia Rye. This I had as an audio influencer copy from Libra FM, which I really appreciate, and I was really bummed because the premise of this was really good, but the execution really didn't work for me. The idea is a cool one. It follows a Muslim Pakistani hijabi woman who is a beauty influencer who ends up developing a relationship with a Bollywood star, and I was like, yeah, that sounds really cool. And it has fake dating in the premise. It's also an attempt at doing a more traditional relationship, people with more traditional values. And it started off strong. I liked the early part of the book, but yeah, this, like, it was very dull. Like, it was very dull, it was very bland, there wasn't really any chemistry between the couple, and like by the end you're supposed to be rooting for them like getting married and stuff pretty quickly, and I was like, I mean, I think they like each other, but like to get married, do they love? I don't know about that. The execution of this just really didn't work, and it's unfortunate because I really like the heroine and I really like the concept, but the way it was done I don't think worked. And it's not because it was a more traditional romance. I think that's the thing. Like, I've read versions of that where there's chemistry between the characters even if they're not like sleeping together. Like, it can be done well. I think this just wasn't, which is unfortunate. I did really like The Right Swipe, which is the first book in the series. Yeah, I found this one to be disappointing, so. Then I gave 2 books 2.5 stars, and one of them I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. The book I talked about in that video is One True King, the Final School for Good and Evil book by Soman Chainani. Another bummer. Oh man, there were so many like anticipated books that were disappointments this month. It was so sad. And then the other book that I gave 2.5 stars to is The Black Company by Glenn Cook. This is a really interesting book. If you want to actually hear detailed thoughts on this one, go watch the live show that I did over on Leanna's channel. I will link it up above. Her and Amanda started a book club called Blades and Bodice Rippers, where they alternate between reading fantasy and romance, and this month me and Mara from Books Like Whoa joined, and secret surprise, we're actually going to become permanent members. So we're going to be part of the Blades and Bodice Rippers book club, which I'm very excited about. But this is the pick. It was published in the 80s, and it's seen as a progenitor of the grimdark fantasy subgenre. And it's a really interesting book. I had very mixed feelings on it. I think I liked it better than any of the other girls in the book club did, and we talked about it for quite a long time. So again, if you want to hear a lot of thoughts on it, check that out. I liked the idea. Like, I didn't like the writing, and I didn't enjoy the experience of reading the book, but I got to the end of it and I was like, that was very interesting. I kind of want to try the next book and learn more and see if the writing gets better. So that's kind of where I'm at with this. I think it's got some really interesting ideas. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here just because we talked about it so much there, and I have a Goodreads review on it. But yeah, interesting book, lots of content warnings and some things that I don't think are handled very well. And the writing and narrative structure are odd, but some cool ideas. So 2.5 stars. All right, next let's look at my 3-star reads. This month there were 4 of them, and 2 of them I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. Those books are Jade City by Fonda Lee and After the Fairy Tale by Terrence Gray, Aaron Day, and Ian Fake. Again, if you want to hear more detailed thoughts on those, check out my mid-month wrap-up. I also gave 3 stars to Hatchet by Gary Paulson. I somehow made it through my childhood without ever reading Hatchet, even though I know it's a childhood classic. It's a survival story aimed at middle grade readers, and yeah, it was really interesting. I'm glad I read it. I read it partly because I am actually currently reading Gary Paulson's memoir. It was sent to me for review from Macmillan Children's, and a lot of his childhood inspired Hatchet and other later books that he read. So I wanted to get to this. I got it from my library and listened to the audiobook. It's very short. It doesn't take long to read. And it was interesting. I think I can definitely see why it has been such a success and why it's really gotten reluctant readers into reading, because it's got a lot of adventure and a lot of plot things happening, but the actual writing itself is pretty simple. It uses short sentences, mostly simple language. It uses a lot of repetition of language, which is one of those things where if you're an adult reader going back and reading it, you might find that irritating. But I think for reluctant readers or younger readers, that can actually be a positive thing for helping them get into the story and feel like they're accomplishing something. The book is also pretty short. A lot happens very quickly, but it's not a long book to get through. So I think reading it as an adult with an eye to the role that has played for readers, young readers, I can see why it has worked so well, even if it wasn't like my favorite book to read personally. It follows a 13-year-old boy whose parents have recently split up, and so part of it is dealing with the trauma of that, of like the divorce, and he is on his way to visit his dad for the first time since the divorce in a small plane when the pilot has a heart attack and the plane crashes in the wilderness, and then he has to survive on his own for like months before he's rescued. And that's basically it. That's the story. And yeah, so for what it is, it's really good. I can see why it's been so award-winning. Is it like the most amazing writing on a prose level? No, but I don't think it's intended to be either, and I think that's fine. So I gave that one 3 stars. I also gave 3 stars to The Valley and the Flood by Rebecca Mahoney. This is an e-arc that I had out from NetGalley, and this was an interesting one. I like what it's trying to do. I think whether or not you're gonna connect with it or how much you'll like it is just gonna really be an individual thing, but I think it's an interesting concept. This is a debut YA story that is using magical realism and this kind of strange town and dreamlike quality as a metaphor for dealing dealing with grief and PTSD. It follows a teen girl whose best friend had died a year previous, and she's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. She has a lot of different symptoms related to that. She deals with severe anxiety, and anyway, so she, for reasons that we eventually learn, is kind of running away from something. I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil things, but she's kind of running away from something. She's driving through the desert when her car breaks down, and then she hears a strange recording from a radio tower, and she follows it, and it leads her to this very odd town where there are prophecies of this flood that's going to destroy the town that she's somehow supposedly bringing with her, and there are these non-human beings, and it's complicated, it's weird, and that may work for some people and may not work for others. It sometimes has kind of a trippy, dreamlike quality to it, but it is about healing. It's about confronting pain and trauma and dealing with the results of that. I liked the fact that it was dealing with those topics for a YA audience. I like the fact that it's very pro-therapy. She has a therapist, and that plays a significant role in the story. Yeah, like, I like a lot of what it's trying to do. I think for whatever reason, I never fully connected emotionally with the characters or with the narrative and what was happening. And then I had an idea of where it was going and what the revelation of all these things that had happened was going to be at the end of the book. And it wasn't what I expected, which is okay, except that it was so different from what had been hinted at. It was a little bit anticlimactic. I don't know, like, it was interesting. It was like an odd choice, I think. Yeah. Like, it was an odd choice to be like hinting that the things we don't know are one thing, and then have it be something completely different. I don't know. It was an interesting book. So there's a lot that I enjoy about it. I think this is a book that some people are really going to love and other people are not going to like so much. I fell in the middle somewhere and gave it 3 stars. All right, moving on, let's talk about my 3.5 star reads. I had 4 of them, and I have not yet talked about any of them. Okay, so first up, I am currently reading the Percy Jackson series, finally, and I had read the first book in the first half of the month, so I talked about that in my mid-month wrap-up, but I also went ahead and read The Sea of Monsters, which is book 2 in the series. I gave this one 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it. I like what it's doing. I don't think I enjoyed this as much as the first one, but I did like it. Again, there are things in the series that are not aging super well, and I think that that's something to be aware of if this is a series you're giving to your kids or reading with your kids. Those are conversations to be had. I don't say this to like be super negative about it, because I think it's a great series and an important series, but just kind of for people to be aware of the fact, and I do get into more specifics of what those are in my Goodreads reviews. I'm putting them in there. I think the main thing that I saw a lot of in this was kind of fat shaming and fat phobia. There were several instances of that. There may have been something else, but again, check out my Goodreads review. Goodreads is always linked down below if you want to hear details. But overall, I enjoyed it. I'm liking the series. I plan to continue, and I really liked the themes here about loving people and caring more about people that matter to you than about like what other people think of you. Yeah, like I liked the personal arc that Percy goes on here. I think it's a good series. I'm going to continue reading them. I also gave 3.5 stars to Waiting for a Scot Like You by Eva Lee. This is the 3rd book in a series of historical romances that are loosely based on 80s teen movies, which I just think is super fun. And this 3rd installment is primarily based on Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which is very fun. It also has some nods to Footloose and to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. So if you are an 80s teen movie lover, you might get a kick out of it, but it is very much its own thing. But it's like got nods to those movies, which I think is fun. This is an opposites attract romance with somewhat of an age gap, with the woman being older. The heroine is a widow on her way to an orgy, and the hero is this kind of uptight former military officer who is escorting her across the country, although he doesn't like officially know where she's going or why, and they have a lot of adventures and misadventures on this road trip by carriage, I suppose you could say, and of course fall for each other. So very steamy. She writes like quite steamy historicals, if that's something that you are looking for. I thought this was fun, although I'm a little bit of a hard sell on a road trip book, and just in general this wasn't as many of my favorite tropes, but even though it's not my favorite book in the series, I did still really enjoy it. I think a lot of people will like it, and probably even like it more than I did, so if it sounds fun, it's probably worth picking up. This is another e-arc that I had from NetGalley. Then I also gave 3.5 stars to Moonstruck Volume 1. This was one of the books that I read for Patreon Book Club. We did a work in translation and we did a graphic novel. So this was the graphic novel that got chosen. And I actually really enjoyed this. The plot has some holes, and like the structure of the plot is not perfect, but it's very, very charming. The artwork is adorable. I had a good time in this world. If I had easy access to another volume of this, I would probably continue to read it. It's just like very cute. It has a lot of very cute elements. It follows a queer girl who is a werewolf and works in a coffee shop, and her new girlfriend who is also a werewolf, and they have some communication difficulties. She has a best friend who also works in the coffee shop who's a gay guy who's a centaur. And, you know, like the plot is not the best. Some of the ways that the relationship issues they have get resolved are not the best, but overall I still had a pretty good time with this and I gave it 3.5 stars. And then my final 3.5 star read is a book that I think I hoped to enjoy more than I actually did. This isn't a bad book and I still enjoyed it reasonably well, but I don't think I'm going to continue on with the series because it wasn't quite what I had hoped for. But this is The Inheritance Games by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. I think the premise of it is really interesting. This had been kind of compared to The Westing Game, which I really loved when I was young, and I was hoping it would be something more akin to that, and it sort of is. Like, elements of it are. It follows a teen girl who comes from a kind of poor, broken background who is suddenly told that she is an heiress to this billionaire who has died, but all of his family is really mad because they wanted the money, and he was always really into like games and clues, and so he's left one behind for her and his grandsons to play to figure out like what he really wanted or why he left her the money. And so I think I was really hoping for this to be more about the riddles and the games and the clues, because the parts of it that focused on that were really interesting to me, but a lot of the book is about teen drama and like, and now we're in the new high school, deal with drama there and boy drama and like, I don't know, which is fine, right? Which is fine. I mean, it's a YA book. That's okay. I think I'm just less interested in that these days, and I was hoping for it to be more focused on the mystery elements of it, because those parts of it were cool. So yeah, a little bit of a mixed experience. This is why I gave it 3.5 stars. I liked it. I didn't love it. I'm not sure I care enough to continue on with the series, but I'm not like upset I read it either. All right, time to talk about my 4-star reads. There were a lot of them. I gave 10 books 4 stars this month, which is a lot, and 3 of them I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. Those books are Percy Jackson, The Lightning Thief by Rick Riordan, A Winter's Promise by Christelle Dabos, and As Far As You'll Take Me by Phil Stamper. If you want to hear about any of those books, check out my mid-month wrap-up. I also gave 4 stars to another audio influencer copy that I had from Libro FM. This is a pretty short nonfiction title called Long Time Coming: Reckoning with Race in America by Michael Eric Dyson. For the most part, I really liked this a lot. It's a series of essays written as letters to Black people who have died at the hands of police. This includes people like Breonna Taylor and Eric Garner, and then of course the one that was really, really gut-wrenching to read, George Floyd. There were others as well, but each letter is kind of also a mini essay about a specific topic, and it's addressing race issues in America throughout history and today, and also talking about and recounting the lives and deaths of these people. And I think it's really powerful. It's really moving. I will say one thing to know about this is the author is a minister, and so this for sure is a more faith-based, hopeful approach to talking about these issues, although I think he really tries to be nuanced and recognize his own bias, and he has a more progressive approach to faith in terms of inclusion, which I appreciated. I think the main thing I didn't love so much here or agree with is there's a section where he talks about cancel culture and is very, very against cancel culture. And I had mixed feelings on this because on the one hand I see some of where he's coming from, of the places where it can become toxic at times and where it can make it hard for people to learn and grow from places that they've been in the past. However, I think to just make a blanket statement that it's bad is not great and not really helpful, because I think frequently that is the only source of justice in an unjust system for people without other forms of power. And like, should it be that way? No, but I feel like it's a little naive for him to feel like, well, no, we just need to like fight harder to get it through the regular justice system. I'm like, yes, do that, but also like, since we're not there, to just blanket say we shouldn't be engaging in cancel culture, I don't know so much about that. But overall, I did really like it. I found it to be pretty powerful and very moving, and I gave this one 4 stars. I also gave 4 stars to Chlorine Sky by Mahogany L. Brown. This I had on audio as a review copy from the Penguin Random House of Volumes app, and this is a YA book of poetry that's kind of a novel in verse. It's a coming-of-age story about a teen girl dealing with a lot of challenging things at home, and also kind of breaking up with a friend, of the two of them breaking apart and experiencing her first boyfriend and her first heartbreak. And I think this is very short, but it's pretty good. I probably wanted a little bit more development at times than we got, and I think it takes a little while to get into it. The early part of it is kind of vague, and it doesn't suck you into the characters and the story right away, but over time it definitely does. And I think it just has a lot of beautiful things to say about coming of age in difficult circumstances and dealing with pain and heartbreak and the loss of friendships. And so yeah, really liked this one. Gave it 4 stars. I also gave 4 stars to Payback by Kristen Simmons. This is the 3rd and final book in the Vale Hall series, which is about a school for teen con artists. It was a pretty good conclusion. A lot of interesting things happened. It nicely tied up all of the plot threads, and I think it was a satisfying conclusion. I do think it's a little bit longer than it needed to be, and things sometimes got dragged out a bit, but overall, I think it's good. I'm happy with it. I'm satisfied with the conclusion. I think, to me, the strongest book in the series is the middle book. That was the one that I gave 5 stars to, and the others have been 4 stars, but overall, it's a really good trilogy. I think it's fun and interesting and has lots of twists and turns that are unexpected. Definitely worth a try. And that one was another e-arc from NetGalley. Then I also gave 4 stars to The Girl from Shadow Springs by Ellie Cipher. This one was actually sent to me by the author for review, which I really appreciate. It was really kind of her. It's a debut YA fantasy that's being pitched as The Revenant meets True Grit with a magical twist, which I think is true. It's got a little bit of a Western vibe, but in this very cold, wintry climate. It's part survival story, but with magic and twists and turns, and I really liked it. I think the writing is very good. It's a little bit of a more slow-paced book, but it has a really satisfying payoff, and I think if you like this kind of story, if you're really into those sort of survival stories, this is a good one. It's also the perfect book to read in wintertime, like you feel the cold. It was actually something where when I was reading it, I had to be like cuddled up with a warm blanket because otherwise it made me feel cold, all the descriptions of this like extreme freezing environment. But yeah, it's got a really strong heroine, it's got interesting twists and turns. I really liked it a lot, and I hope people will pick it up. It's coming out this month in February. Then I gave 4 stars to an audio review copy I had from NetGalley. This is All Things Bright and Beautiful by James Herriot. It's a re-release of the audiobook for book 2 in this classic series of memoirs. This recounts his time working as an animal doctor pre-World War II in Yorkshire, England. And again, much like the first volume, I enjoyed this quite a lot. It's very charming. It's got lots of quirky characters, funny stories, heartwarming stories. Yeah, it was really good. I didn't enjoy it quite as much as the first book, but I liked it, and this volume ends with him going off to war for World War II. So yeah, a classic, and I think worthy of classic status for sure. Man, so many 4 stars, oh my gosh, okay. Then another 4-star read that I had was fun. This is something where I was coming off a really, really intense thriller that was fantastic, and you're gonna hear about it later, but I finished it and I was like, oh my gosh, that was a lot. I need something light. And so I decided to pick up an erotic sci-fi romance novella, which was the perfect thing. This is When She's Ready by Ruby Dixon. Ruby Dixon writes these really kind of wild, out there stories that are very campy and don't take themselves too seriously, and I think that just makes them fun. This is one of the first books in her Rizdiverse series, which follows a group of human women who had originally been kidnapped from Earth and now have been freed and given land to farm on this planet, but some of the local aliens are looking to steal their land, and so to protect themselves they need to get married. So it's like a marriage of convenience plot. It's a pretty short novella. She gets married to one of the, you know, blue aliens that you see in her Ice Planet Barbarian series, but this is just a trope that I tend to enjoy more than the ones in that. So yeah, I liked this. I plan to continue on with this series. I gave it 4 stars, and it was the perfect thing after a very dark book. The final book that I gave 4 stars to is a book that was sent to me for review by Orbit. They sent me this beautiful finished copy of The Mask of Mirrors by M.A. Carrick. I love the cover. It is a tome. Like, this is really long, guys. And this is one that I did as a blended read. I listened to the audiobook and read the physical book and kind of switched back and forth and sometimes did them together, which I think was probably good. This is an interesting one because I think there are people who are going to love it and people who are not gonna like it quite so much. It's really interesting and has a lot of intricate world building. It's a multi-perspective fantasy, but the main character is a female con artist who's trying to worm her way into one of the high houses or like elite houses of this city. And the politics in the city, I think, is loosely based on Italian city-states. Like, that's kind of what it reminds me of in terms of the political structure, but with magic systems. And the magic systems are really interesting. There's 2 primary ones. One of them is kind of similar to tarot reading, of like, you read like people's past, present, and future through these cards, but there's magic associated with it. And then there's the magic of the more elite, which is a written academic form of magic. And yeah, I think this is really interesting. There's lots of kind of twists and turns and political intrigue, and I really liked it a lot. I will say it is a slower paced book. It's got a lot of detail, it doesn't move very quickly, and it's got a lot of characters to keep track of, a lot of moving pieces. And so it's one of those things where I could see some people being like, this is so slow, it's not interesting enough, I need more plot, I need more things to happen quickly. And they wouldn't like it. I think other people are gonna read this and be like, this is really cool. I love these characters. I love the intricacies of the world and the magic system. I love the slow, like, twisty uncovering of what's really going on. So yeah, it's a little bit of a mixed bag. I do think it's longer than it needs to be. I don't think it needed to be quite as long as it is, but I enjoyed it and I gave it 4 stars. Moving on, let's talk about my 4.5 star reads. This month there were 5 of them, and 3 of them I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. Those books are The Gilded Ones by Namina Forna, Shield of Winter by Nalini Singh, and A Dead Djinn in Cairo by P. Jelly Clark. I also gave 4.5 stars to A Sky Beyond the Storm by Sabaa Tahir. This is the final book in the Ember and the Ashes quartet, and I really liked it a lot. I think it's a very strong conclusion to the series. I've enjoyed the series quite a bit, and I liked the way that she wrapped everything up. I think she did a nice job of tying up the threads. I liked the endings that she had for the different characters, and yeah, like, there's not a lot I can say about this without spoiling things. I will say this. I kind of went into this a little bit nervous because I was like, oh my gosh, she's gonna like rip my heart out. And look, I've read a lot of very dark fantasy, so while, yes, there are for sure very sad and tragic and violent things that happen in this book, not everybody from this large cast of characters will survive. I also was like low-key expecting her to take it farther than she did. It is a relatively hopeful ending, and I think there's a lot that's really beautiful in here about family and motherhood and sisterhood and just love that I think is beautiful. And some of it is sad, some of it is bittersweet, some of it is tragic, and some of it is really hopeful. So I was very satisfied with this. I didn't think it was overly dark, but I think the series as a whole, as a YA fantasy series, is certainly much darker and much more violent than what you might typically see. But yeah, I really liked it. I thought it was very good. I gave it 4.5 stars. I also gave 4.5 stars to a book that I picked up because of Mara at Books Like Whoa. This is The Perilous Guard by Elizabeth Marie Pope. This was so great. I really enjoyed it a lot. It's a classic work of children's literature from the 1970s that is now out of print, so I had to like track down a used copy of it. But this was great. It's very interesting and definitely different from what you would expect in children's literature or YA literature today. Darker and a little slower paced. I would say that this is mostly historical fiction, but with a speculative element to it. It's set in the 1500s and it follows a young woman who is exiled by Queen Mary Tudor to this sort of faraway estate called the Perilous Guard. And while there, she gets drawn into these kind of dark secrets involving the Fae. I really liked it. I think it's really interesting. And I think what's interesting to me about this is compared to a lot of the fairy or fae books that we read today, this feels much more grounded. Like there is magic and there are these other beings, but the way that it's written, it feels like it could have actually happened. It feels real. It doesn't feel fantastical, which I think is an interesting thing to accomplish. The other kind of cool thing about this is it's illustrated, so you get like illustrations throughout it. I really liked it a lot, and I think especially when I was a teenager, I would have loved this and eaten it up. It does get kind of dark. I mean, like some of their rituals involve like human sacrifice, so like there's dark themes that are being dealt with, but yeah, this was very good. Not really what I was expecting. And one thing that I thought was interesting that I discovered after finishing it is Holly Black credits this as being an influence on her writing. So as a foundational text, I suppose, to YA fae stories, it might be worth a look. So yeah, this was interesting. This is one that I did some of the time. I listened to it on audio. It is available through audio on Scribd, but that ended up being a little slow for me, so I kind of went back and forth and read a good chunk of it physically as well. So somebody had asked me to talk more about which books I listen to on audio, so I'm trying to be better about telling you guys that. All right, moving on, let's talk about my 5-star reads. This month there were only 3 of them, which is lower than usual, and 2 of them I talked about in my mid-month wrap-up. Those books are Ariadne by Jennifer St. and The Echo Wife by Sarah Gailey. Again, if you want to hear about those, check out my mid-month wrap-up. The other thing that I gave 5 stars to this month was The Project by Courtney Summers. Remember I said I finished this really dark thriller and needed something light to perk me up afterwards? This was the one. I loved it. I think it does what it's trying to do very, very well. But guys, like, it is super dark. Definitely check content trigger warnings if you need them at all. And reading Goodreads reviews is interesting because I think a lot of people are going into this expecting something different from what it is, and I'm not sure how much of that is the marketing, how much of that is their expectations based on other books that they've read from Courtney Summers. So let's talk a little bit about what this book is. I think it's fantastic, but like you should probably know what it is and what it isn't. So this follows 2 sisters in a split timeline. So we have a current day timeline and then we have a past timeline from the older sister's perspective. And what we know is that years earlier when the younger sister was like 12 or 13, their whole family was in a really serious car accident. The parents died and the younger sister almost died. And the older sister basically prayed and like promised anything if God would save her. And this man came and apparently healed her sister. And he was the leader of this cult that she got drawn into. In the current timeline, the sister who had survived the accident is now like 19 and hasn't spoken to her sister in years and is trying to track down what happened and like expose this cult for what she believes it is. Okay, so that's all I'm going to really say about the plot. Here's what I think this book does really well and totally nails, is it gets inside the psychology of what draws people into cults and what keeps them there, even when they become abusive. And that I think is disturbing, but very accurate, and I think that's depicted really well. It's clear that she like knows what she's talking about or did a lot of research on what she's talking about. So I think that is so well done. It's really interesting. I like books like this, books about cults. This is very, very dark though. Like a lot of people are probably gonna say this isn't really YA, and it is like right on that line where I'm like, the thing that makes it feel maybe kind of YA to me is the fact that the dark things that happen mostly aren't graphically described on page. So there's a lot of bad stuff that happens and we know it's happening, but most of it is not graphically described on page, and I feel like most of the time a book like this targeted at an adult audience would have gone farther with those descriptions. But other than that, like it is a lot. So I would not recommend this for your average teenager, I guess. But that said, I think it's phenomenal. I think it does what it does very, very well. I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. But at the end of it, I was like, oh my goodness, that was intense. That was a lot. I need something light to lighten the mood. So yeah, really curious to hear what people think as they start reading it, because the book just came out. It's going to be an interesting one. All right. With that said, we are down to my 6-star reads. And again, 6 stars on my personal rating scale is what I give to a favorite of the year or favorite of all time. And what a great month for them. I had 4 of them this month, which is rare. That doesn't happen often, and I'm very pleased. I did talk about 2 of these books in my mid-month wrap-up, and one of them, I think, in my mid-month wrap-up, I was like hovering between a 5 and a 6 star, but I've decided to go ahead and give this 6 stars. I do think this is going to be one of my favorite romances that I read this year, but again, I talked about it in more detail in that video. That is Her Wicked Marquess by Stacey Reed. And I also gave 6 stars to The Return of the Thief by Megan Whalen Turner. If you want to hear more detailed thoughts on either of those 2 books, check out my mid-month wrap-up. I also gave 6 stars to Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell. I loved this so much that I decided to make a standalone video review for it. So if you want to hear more about this book, I'm going to direct you to that video, which I will link up above, but I'm just gonna say this is the perfect blend of politically driven science fiction and a queer slow burn romance. I would say this is a great entry point for anybody who reads sci-fi and is interested in getting into romance, or anybody who reads romance and is interested in getting into science fiction. This would be a fantastic book to pick up. I loved it a whole lot. And yeah, if you want to hear more details, I have more to say in that review. So go check it out. This one, this is a new release as well, so really loved it. And the final book that I gave 6 stars to this month is one that I read slowly throughout the month, like an essay at a time, and it's a nonfiction title. This is Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. I really don't know how I got this far in my life without having read anything by Audre Lorde, because she is brilliant and this is amazing. As you can see, I tabbed the hell out of it. It was incredible. Not very long, but one that I just really needed to sit with and think about. So I didn't want to read it quickly or read a lot at a time. I would read an essay, think about it, read another essay. So it took me most of the month to get through this, but I am really happy that I decided to read it, and this does count as one of my classics for the year, which is cool. If you're not familiar with Audre Lorde, she was a Black lesbian feminist thinker and poet, and oh man, like this really should be required reading. People should for sure read this. If you're not going to read anything else, if you want to just read a couple of essays, I think the 2 that I would direct you to most, and I may even like read a couple of little excerpts from these, because I mean there was a lot that was really powerful, but the 2 that I personally found to be most meaningful, that I got a lot out of, are The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House is one of them, and the other one that I think is particularly good, I mean it's all good, but the other big one was The Uses of Anger, Women Responding to Racism. I think those 2 in particular I just took so much from. They're not very long, but they really pack a punch. And I think it's interesting reading this too, because I can see how a lot of the things that she said threaded into other anti-racist and feminist books that I have since read, more recent works. And so it's clear that a lot of what she was saying here was very foundational, and I think this is well worth your time. She talks about gender and race and sexuality sexuality and just has this vision of people coming together and working together and having a more inclusive type of feminism. I think what's interesting too is there are so many things she says that are conversations we're still having today and things we are still working at today, especially a lot of her commentary on women's anger, the power of it when it's channeled for use, I think is really important. She also has a whole thing that I think is really valuable where, and then I think like to women showing anger to each other she talks about, and it's interesting, like when, I'll read a little bit here, but she says, "It is not the anger of other women that will destroy us, but our refusals to stand still, to listen to its rhythms, to learn within it, to move beyond the manner of presentation to the substance." To tap that anger as an important source of empowerment. And I think this is really important, especially as we're talking about race and anger, especially thinking about this for me as a white woman, the importance of being less concerned about the way people express themselves, the way they express their anger, and more about the content of what they're saying, because that's really what matters. And so I think that's really powerful. And then I think too, you know, stuff that gets repeated in new ways in hood feminism, which talks about the fact that white versions of feminism are inadequate, some of that is also coming from here. So I'll read just like a couple sentences from the Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House. That was the other essay that I really got a lot out of. She says, "If white American feminist theory need not deal with the differences between us and the resulting difference in our oppressions, then how do you deal with the fact that the women who clean your houses and tend your children while you attend conferences on feminist theory are for the most part poor women and women of color? What is the theory behind racist feminism?" Yeah, like she's amazing. She does not pull her punches. She will probably make you uncomfortable, but in a really positive way. And she's also funny. She's got this like dry sense of humor that comes through some of the time. So I really loved this. It's a book that I am so glad I finally read, one that I expect to return to, and one too that I could see being really valuable is like a communal reading experience of like reading and discussing essay by essay with others in community, because there's just so much to be gained from it. So yeah, really, really love this. Definitely gonna be one of my favorite nonfiction books that I read this year. Okay, so that is it. That is January. Those are all of the books that I read this month. I think it's been a very productive reading month. I've had some new favorites, a lot of new favorites, and you know, some things that were a little bit more disappointing, but I'm not upset about it, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in February. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know any of your thoughts or feelings on anything I talked about today. And for your question of the day, tell me about a book that you read slowly, a book that you wanted to savor, that you wanted to think about, and you didn't want to rush through, because I think Sister Outsider was one of those books for me. You know, sometimes reading books for me is more like consuming entertainment, kind of like watching a television show, and I can read really quickly and might enjoy it, but I'm not taking a lot of time with it. But books like Sister Outsider are ones that I'm like, I need to sit with this, I need to think about this, I need to take my time with it. And I think that both of those approaches to reading are valid, and it's cool to have books that can be one or the other, and also people who primarily read in one way versus another way, and I think that's an interesting conversation to have. So talk to me down below and let me know about a book that you've read that you really sat with and took your time with. If you guys like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more, and if you want to support the work of the channel, check out the Patreon linked down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.